There is a moment in every relationship when the conversation stops being about the dishes, the plans, or the tone of a single sentence, and becomes about something far more fragile, far more human. It becomes about the part of you that feels threatened, exposed, or unseen. And rather than admit that, rather than reveal the tender place where longing meets fear, we reach instead for the shield we know best, the ego. The ego steps forward with its familiar swagger, telling you that you must win, you must defend, you must prove. It convinces you that vulnerability is too costly, that softness will make you lose ground. And so you protect yourself, not realizing that in doing so, you are slowly losing the very thing you're trying to hold on to. Ego is often celebrated as a mark of strength, a symbol of self-assuredness, or a protective mechanism that keeps us safe from harm, but in the context of intimate relationships, it functions in a far more complex and sometimes destructive way. At its core, ego acts as a protective armor, shielding the vulnerable, tender parts of ourselves that we fear may not be accepted or loved. It whispers to us that showing weakness is dangerous, that revealing our insecurities or our deepest needs could lead to rejection or humiliation. And so, the ego steps forward, presenting a version of ourselves that is confident, controlled, and even commanding, yet this outward display often masks a hidden fragility. In relationships, this can be particularly insidious because intimacy demands exposure, but the ego is never comfortable with exposure. It prefers negotiation from a safe distance, maintaining boundaries that feel secure, even if those boundaries also block genuine connection. The protective nature of ego manifests in countless subtle ways. When a partner expresses disappointment or criticism, the ego can immediately shift us into defense mode. A simple disagreement becomes a battleground, not because of the issue itself, but because the ego perceives any challenge as a threat to our identity. We insist on being right, we rationalize, we blame, we deflect, all as strategies to preserve the narrative we've created about ourselves. The irony is that the ego's strategies are designed to prevent emotional pain, yet they often generate exactly the kind of tension and distance that produces pain in relationships. The more we cling to our ego, the less room there is for vulnerability, and the less room there is for vulnerability, the less intimacy can flourish. The ego, in trying to protect us, paradoxically undermines the very thing we desire most, emotional closeness and connection. Ego also interferes with empathy, which is the bridge between two people's inner worlds. When ego dominates, our attention becomes focused on ourselves, on defending our choices, preserving our dignity, and maintaining control over how we are perceived rather than on truly listening to the other person. This self-focus limits our capacity to fully understand our partner's perspective and respond with care. In doing so, we inadvertently create patterns of miscommunication, frustration, and misunderstanding, even when the intentions of both partners are pure. The ego is relentless in maintaining the illusion of control, but relationships are inherently unpredictable, vulnerable, and dynamic. The armor we wear may make us feel safe temporarily, but it also hardens us, creating distance and preventing the natural flow of give and take that love requires. Recognizing the ego for what it is, a protective mechanism, not an infallible guide, is the first step toward learning how to lower the defenses and allow ourselves to be truly seen in relationships. One of the most insidious ways ego manifests is through the desire for control, the relentless need to be right, to dominate the narrative, or to steer outcomes according to our personal preferences. While it might feel natural to defend our perspective or insist on our way, this insistence often comes at a steep emotional cost. The need to control situations, conversations, and even emotions is not about fairness or justice, it is about protecting a fragile sense of self that fears being diminished, overlooked, or invalidated. When we allow ego to dictate our interactions, every disagreement becomes a silent battle for dominance, and every decision becomes a test of who holds more power. This dynamic, subtle as it may appear at first, slowly erodes trust and intimacy because it shifts the focus from partnership to personal validation. Love, at its essence, requires collaboration, curiosity, and openness, yet ego-driven control converts these moments into contests, leaving little room for authentic connection. The compulsion to assert control often expresses itself in everyday interactions. It might appear as interrupting a partner to correct them, insisting on a specific outcome in shared decisions, or fixating on perceived slights and injustices. These actions, while sometimes unconscious, communicate a powerful message that the egoed self is more important than the relationship itself. The partner on the receiving end may feel unheard, dismissed, or devalued, leading to defensiveness or withdrawal. This, in turn, triggers the ego further, creating a self-perpetuating cycle where control is reinforced as a necessary defense against emotional exposure. Each participant becomes trapped, responding to egoic triggers rather than approaching each moment with openness, curiosity, and empathy. Ego-driven control also undermines the delicate balance of autonomy and intimacy that relationships require. In attempting to maintain control, one may unknowingly stifle the partner's individuality or independence, creating resentment and frustration. A relationship is healthiest when both individuals feel free to express themselves, make choices, and be seen for who they truly are. When ego insists on dominating, this freedom is compromised, and intimacy suffers. The very closeness we seek is replaced by tension, power struggles, and a persistent sense of unease. In these moments, it becomes clear that the struggle is not about the argument or the decision at hand, it is about the ego protecting itself from vulnerability, from admitting uncertainty, from relinquishing the illusion of mastery over love. Recognizing this dynamic is crucial because it allows partners to step back, pause, and choose connection over control, understanding that surrendering the need to dominate is not weakness but a profound act of relational courage. Beneath every ego-driven reaction in a relationship lies a quieter, often unacknowledged force: fear. The ego does not operate in a vacuum, it is fueled by deep-seated anxieties about rejection, inadequacy, and the possibility of losing oneself in another person. When we feel threatened by disagreement, criticism, or even the simple vulnerability of expressing our emotions, the ego leaps forward, insisting that we defend, protect, and assert ourselves. What appears on the surface as anger, defensiveness, or rigidity is often a disguised form of fear, a mechanism designed to preserve the self from perceived danger. The challenge in intimate relationships is that these fears are rarely rational. They are remnants of past experiences, early attachments, and internalized beliefs about worthiness and love. The ego, in trying to shield us from being hurt, amplifies these fears, often creating exactly the pain it seeks to avoid. Fear manifests in countless subtle ways, shaping interactions and decisions. We may insist on being right, not because the facts demand it, but because conceding feels like a threat to our self-esteem. We may withdraw or become silent, not because the conversation is unimportant, but because speaking up feels unsafe in the shadow of possible judgment or rejection. The fear of vulnerability drives us to build walls, erect defenses, and craft personas that appear strong, confident, or unshakable. Yet beneath these protective layers, the longing for closeness remains, creating a tension between what we crave and what we allow ourselves to receive. The ego convinces us that maintaining control, asserting superiority, or suppressing vulnerability is the only way to stay safe, even as it perpetuates distance, misunderstanding, and emotional isolation. Fear also subtly dictates patterns of blame and projection. When the ego feels threatened, it often externalizes discomfort, attributing faults to the partner rather than examining the underlying insecurities within ourselves. This defensive stance is an attempt to regain a sense of stability and control, yet it often escalates conflict and deepens emotional distance. The partner, encountering the ego's armor, may respond with their own defenses, triggering a cycle where fear and ego feed one another. Over time, this cycle can erode trust, diminish empathy, and prevent the authentic sharing of emotions that is essential for intimacy. Recognizing the role of fear beneath the surface of ego-driven behavior is crucial, because it reframes conflict not as an attack but as a signal that beneath the bravado and defensiveness lies a human being longing to be understood, seen, and loved. By naming this fear and observing its influence, we can begin to respond with compassion rather than reactivity, opening the possibility for deeper connection and more conscious, intentional engagement with one another. Ego is a powerful engine behind the patterns of blame and defensiveness that so often define relationships. When conflict arises, it is rarely just about the immediate disagreement, it is a reflection of the ego protecting itself, reacting instinctively to perceived threats, and attempting to maintain a sense of control or superiority. The cycle begins subtly, One partner expresses frustration or disappointment, and the ego immediately interprets it as a personal attack. Rather than responding with curiosity or openness, the mind shifts to defense, constructing arguments, rationalizations, or counterattacks to preserve self-image. What follows is rarely a measured conversation. It becomes a pattern of reactivity, where the focus is no longer on understanding or connection but on defending the ego and preserving pride. Over time, these habitual responses create a feedback loop, reinforcing emotional distance and misunderstanding, and making it increasingly difficult to break free from entrenched cycles of conflict. Blame is a particularly insidious tool of the ego because it externalizes the problem, placing responsibility on the partner instead of examining one's own role in the dynamic. When one partner feels hurt or disappointed, the ego often responds by deflecting, shifting attention away from self-reflection, and attributing fault externally. This not only avoids the discomfort of vulnerability but also subtly reinforces the belief that being right is more important than being connected. Defensiveness compounds the issue. Every perceived accusation triggers a need to protect, explain, or justify, escalating tensions and pushing partners further apart. The very behaviors intended to maintain self-respect or emotional safety paradoxically deepen conflict, creating cycles that can persist for years if left unexamined. These patterns are further reinforced by repetition and familiarity. Couples often fall into predictable sequences. A perceived slight leads to a defensive response, which triggers the partner's defense, and soon both are caught in a loop that feels almost automatic. The ego thrives in this repetition because it validates its own narrative. It reassures itself that being on guard is necessary, that emotional exposure is risky, and that maintaining a rigid stance is synonymous with strength. Yet, the cost of this cycle is profound. Emotional intimacy diminishes, trust erodes, and the relationship becomes less a shared journey and more a battlefield of egoic defenses. Partners may feel misunderstood, frustrated, or emotionally exhausted, yet struggle to break the pattern because the ego interprets any attempt to soften as weakness. Recognizing this cycle is the first step toward transformation, as it allows couples to see conflict not as a judgment of character, but as a reflection of defensive mechanisms in motion, opening the door to conscious intervention, empathy, and a more intentional, collaborative approach to resolving differences. Softening the ego is perhaps the most courageous act one can undertake in a relationship, for it requires relinquishing the familiar defenses that have long felt like protection and stepping into a space of uncertainty and vulnerability. Letting love in is not about surrendering power or abandoning one's identity. It is about creating room for genuine connection, curiosity, and empathy to flourish. When the ego dominates, it interprets intimacy as a threat, equating openness with weakness and emotional transparency with risk. Yet the truth is that intimacy cannot exist without the willingness to show oneself fully, the fears, the desires, the contradictions, and the imperfections. By gradually loosening the grip of the ego, partners allow themselves to experience each other without filters, assumptions, or rigid expectations, creating a fertile ground where emotional safety and mutual understanding can grow. This process begins with awareness. Recognizing when ego-driven responses are taking over is essential because it illuminates the difference between reactive behavior and intentional choice. The moment one notices a defensive posture, a need to be right, or an urge to control, it becomes possible to pause, breathe, and respond differently. This pause is transformative. It interrupts the habitual cycle of reactivity and opens space for reflection and empathy. In doing so, partners can choose to prioritize understanding over argument, connection over victory, and curiosity over judgment. Softening the ego requires the courage to face discomfort without immediately seeking to resolve or defend against it. It is in that space of tolerance for uncertainty that authentic communication arises, allowing both individuals to be heard, acknowledged, and valued without the interference of protective mechanisms. Letting love in also requires humility, the willingness to acknowledge mistakes, to apologize without defensiveness, and to embrace the possibility that one does not always have the answers. Humility does not diminish self-worth. Instead, it strengthens relationships by fostering trust and demonstrating that both partners are committed to growth and mutual care. When ego softens, empathy naturally follows. The ability to truly listen, to witness a partner's experience without immediate judgment or interruption, allows both individuals to feel understood and validated. In this dynamic, love is no longer transactional or conditional, it becomes a shared experience of presence, acceptance, and mutual vulnerability. By choosing connection over ego, partners create an environment where intimacy can flourish, where conflict is no longer a battlefield but an opportunity for growth, and where the relationship evolves into a space of deep emotional resonance, trust, and shared humanity.